All right, so Truman is president from 1946 to 1952 when he is traded in favor of... All right, so Truman is the dominant figure of the first part of the American Cold War saga. The one who takes the lead role in the second part is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower should be a familiar name to you. He was the Allied commander during the Second World War, which made him particularly famous and is going to be extremely useful in his election campaign. In 1952, Eisenhower is going to run on the Republican ticket, emerging as a military leader with the greatest political appeal, partly because of the image of sort of fatherly warmth that set him apart from other successful generals. His decision to run as a Republican came in large part because he became convinced that Senator Robert Taft, who was the leading contender for the Republican nomination, would try to lead the U.S. back into isolationism. And so he decided to challenge him on those grounds. Eisenhower chose as his vice presidential candidate World War II veteran Richard Nixon, made himself a name in the Senate as a vigorous anti-communism crusader. He was elected to the Senate in 1950 in a campaign where he suggested that his Democratic opponent had communist sympathies. He had something of a reputation for opportunism and dishonesty, being somewhat connected to the McCarthy trials, but his populist brand of free market conservatism was also appealing. He was a shrewd politician who sought to change the image of the Republican Party from a defender of business to the champion of the quote-unquote forgotten man. By using populist language to promote free market economies, he helped to lay the foundation for the triumph of conservatism later. We also see in the election of 1952 a demonstration of television significance, as it allowed candidates to bring carefully crafted images directly into American homes, and this was the first campaign to make an extensive use of TV ads. Ultimately, Eisenhower came out victorious in the election of 1952. His popularity and the public weariness with the Korean War, Ike promised to go over personally to lead negotiations, ultimately led to a resounding victory. His popularity, however, didn't extend to the rest of his party. He became the first president to win the presidency without his party also controlling either the House or the Senate in 1956. People were comforted, however, by familiar elderly leaders, and this was a kind of worldwide trend. So you have Eisenhower getting elected in the United States. Churchill is re-elected in the UK, Charles de Gaulle in France. So older figures who feel more steady and stable in a period that is increasingly unstable elsewhere. Domestically, Eisenhower espoused a policy that modern historians refer to as modern republicanism. His administration was very pro-business. Wealthy businessmen ultimately dominated his cabinet. He was fiscally conservative, working to scale back government spending, including the military budget. However, despite the fiscal conservatism and pro-business outlook, he also retained and even expanded many New Deal programs. Republicans in Congress saw his victory as an invitation to roll back New Deal programs, but Ike knew that this would be disastrous, and instead he defended and oversaw the expansion of programs like Social Security, calling his domestic agenda modern republicanism to help sever the association with the Depression and Hooverism, if you like. He also wanted to avoid European-style nationalism, so opposing things like a national health system. Ike also endorsed using the government to spur productivity and employment. Key examples are things like the interstate highway system. This was the largest public works enterprise in American history, building over 41,000 miles of interstate highways, justified using Cold War arguments, i.e. the need to evacuate cities quickly. Auto manufacturers and associate industries and workers also had more practical reasons to support it because more roads would mean more cars. We'll also see Eisenhower supporting things like the National Defense Education Act. This act provided direct federal funding for higher education, particularly in areas like science, technology, mathematics, and foreign language. The Cold War is obviously a huge motivator for Ike and his domestic policies, but economic prosperity also played a really key role in this move. Eisenhower also supported the idea of a kind of social contract between labor and management, hoping to ease the conflict that was characteristic of the period immediately following the Second World War in the 1940s. The Taft-Hartley Act was a contributor to this. We're also going to see the consolidation of organized labor with the merger of the AFL and CIO, which represented 35% of all non-agricultural workers. This social contract would require unions to sign long-term agreements that would leave the decision about future capital investment and plant locations in the hands of management. And employers would stop trying to eliminate existing unions and grant wage increases and other fringe benefits. The outcome for working class America was mixed. Union workers saw unprecedented prosperity, but non-union workers didn't really get so much out of the deal. This social contract did not apply to the majority of workers not affiliated with unions. However, some did get some indirect benefits. For example, trade unions were able to use their political power to win a steady increase in the minimum wage, which applied to all workers, both non-union and union alike. There was, however, some marginalization for non-union workers. The majority didn't enjoy anything close to the benefits that were gained by union workers. The social contract will, of course, start to fray at the seams. By 1959, a steel strike will bring it crashing down to the ground. The industry seeking to tighten work rules and limit wage increases in order to boost profits will send 500,000 workers on strike to stop those changes, and the social contract will come to a very abrupt end. Changing gears to foreign policy now, Eisenhower is going to largely continue the containment policy of Truman, but he's going to put his own kind of spin on it. And that is the policy of massive retaliation.
Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin led their nations from World War victory in 1945 through 7 years of tense confrontation. By 1953, it was time for a new generation of cold warriors to take command. In Washington, the changing of the guard came democratically.
The people speak, and their verdict, a landslide victory for Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected president with the greatest popular vote ever given a White House candidate.
The hero of D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, became the first Republican president in 20 years. On the campaign trail, Eisenhower pledged to take a hard line with the Soviet Union and to bring an end to the war in Korea.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
As president, Eisenhower continued the policy of containment, but his administration's new look defense strategy relied more heavily on air power and nuclear weapons. Deploying an effective nuclear arsenal was easier and cheaper than maintaining a massive land army. Eisenhower could defend the nation, cut taxes, and curb inflation, all at the same time. In the expression of the day, it was a bigger bang for the buck. The new look was not just economical, it was aggressive. The White House adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. It stated that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, the U.S. would respond by launching more than 3,000 nuclear missiles against every major urban, industrial, and military target throughout the communist world. Experts estimated that such an attack would kill 285 million people. President Eisenhower refused to consider options that stopped short of total war. But even as the Eisenhower White House was refining its Cold War strategy, news from Moscow that Joseph Stalin had died dramatically altered the playing field. The official cause was a stroke, but many suspected poison. Without a plan for succession, a collective leadership assumed control of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, they extended an olive branch to the west. Speaking for the party, Georgy Malenkov declared, "We stand as we have always stood, for peaceful coexistence of the two systems." Coming from the avowed enemy of capitalism, peaceful coexistence was a radical notion. Was this just Soviet propaganda, or was the new Kremlin really different than the old? In an address dubbed Chance for Peace, Eisenhower called on the Soviets to demonstrate they had truly broken with Stalin's legacy.
I know of only one question upon which progress waits. It is this: what is the Soviet Union ready to do? Whatever the answer is, let it be plainly spoken. Again we say the hunger for peace is too great, the hour in history too late for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures.
Before the Soviets could respond, the president's seemingly genuine offer was contradicted by his own Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He ridiculed the idea of peaceful coexistence as a ploy to divide the Western allies, adding, "We are not dancing to any Russian tune." The chance for peace, if it ever existed, was squandered, and U.S.-Soviet relations continued to vacillate between measured tolerance and outright disdain.
All right, so Eisenhower's foreign policy is containment, but it's also containment on a budget, I guess you could say. We do want to keep communism from spreading, but we also want to cut taxes and save money and things like that. And so the policy of massive retaliation is going to rely on two things. Mostly it's going to rely on the Air Force, on air power in the United States, and on the bomb. Now, as we come into the 1950s, both the US and then the Soviet Union will create a hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bombs are like atom bombs, but they're much bigger and much more powerful. And this is going to really kick off a nuclear arms race between the two, and they're going to contribute massively to this new policy of massive retaliation. The policy is ultimately announced by John Foster Dulles, who is Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and it is essentially that any Soviet attack on America or any of her allies will be countered by a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union and its allies as well. This policy is characterized by brinkmanship, essentially running the risk that any small conflict, even a miscalculation, could ultimately escalate into a war that could destroy both sides effectively. This also would ultimately lead to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, inspiring widespread fear of impending nuclear war, both in the United States and around the globe. Mutually assured destruction is essentially resting on the idea that if you launch an attack at me, I will in turn launch an attack at you. We will destroy each other. And so in order to avoid that catastrophic outcome, we will both have to not go to war. It's effective in that it uses fear of destruction quite usefully. But again, if you blink, this is tied into brinkmanship as well. If you blink, then your opponent has the advantage over you. So you're trapping yourself into a catastrophic decision, almost at the drop of a hat. Now, Eisenhower actually has a fairly good relationship with the new Soviet premier after Stalin dies, who eventually that settles on the shoulders of Nikita Khrushchev. The two met in 1955 in Geneva, where they also met with North Korea in order to negotiate. But while nothing tangible came of that meeting, observers hailed the new spirit of Geneva, a kind of toleration of one another, I guess you could say. Khrushchev also actively denounced Stalin, calling for coexistence in 1956, delivering a speech detailing Stalin's crimes and calling for peaceful coexistence with the United States. However, there are some setbacks. The first of these comes in Hungary. Soviet repression of an anti-communist uprising in Hungary gets a poor reception in the United States. Eisenhower refuses to intervene, however, indicating he believed it impossible to roll back Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. Not really the most popular decision that he could have made, but it enabled us to resume the thaw between the two powers. Weapons testing was halted in 1958 by a mutual agreement, and Khrushchev even made a visit. The second and perhaps most detrimental setback, though, came in 1960 when the Soviets discovered an American spy plane.
In the late 1950s, it seemed as if the Cold War was beginning to thaw. President Dwight Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had a good relationship, and the two nations seemed to be cooperating. Unfortunately, the peace would not last. In 1960, an American U-2 plane was shot down over Soviet airspace. So what kind of plane was the U-2? What did the United States use it for? In the mid-1950s, the U.S. government saw the need for a new type of aircraft, a spy plane capable of flying high above the Soviet Union for the purposes of photographing bases and installations in order to monitor Soviet military strength. Lockheed, one of the United States' top manufacturers of aircraft, was contracted to build the planes. The end result of their efforts was the Utility Plane II, or the U-2 for short. The plane was capable of flying at altitudes up to 14 miles high and could stay in the air up to 11 hours. High-powered cameras on the aircraft could photograph a golf ball placed on a putting green 14 miles below. The pilots who flew the U-2 were required to wear a pressurized suit during flights because of the altitude, and could not drink any liquids for several hours prior to each flight. The flights usually lasted in between 7 to 8 hours. The U-2 made its first flight in 1957 and worked precisely as it was built to. As a result of the flights, the United States discovered that the Soviet military was not nearly as large or powerful as they were making the rest of the world believe. But, in April of 1960, a U-2 piloted by Gary Powers was making a routine flight over the Soviet Union when the plane was struck by a Soviet missile. Powers parachuted safely to the ground, but was captured by the Soviet military. The incident provided proof of what the Soviets had been claiming for some time. The United States had been spying on the USSR. With this discovery, the American-Soviet relationship was shattered. Because of the U-2 incident, the Cold War divide deepened even further, and it would be another 25 years before the tensions softened again and any real progress would be made between the two nations.
All right, so the United States and the Soviet Union had a relatively good relationship with one another prior to this incident in 1960. And although Eisenhower denied that the plane was engaged in espionage and refused to apologize even after the Soviets produced the pilot, it was clear that the U.S. was spying on the Russians and that our peaceful coexistence was put in jeopardy at this point as well. If you are at all interested in this incident or the fate of Gary Powers, there is a fantastic movie. Scenes from the movie were taken, in fact, in the video that we just watched called Bridge of Spies. And I would highly recommend it if you're interested at all in this incident. Our last lecture is going to deal with kind of looking at the rest of the world, the third world, and how the Cold War between the two superpowers is affecting these areas.